Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the theory that Bart Ehrman has about alleged increasing anti-Semitism in the gospel stories of Jesus' death, and particularly Jesus' interactions with Pilate and Pilate's interactions with the people who bring Jesus to him to be condemned. Several years ago, Bart Ehrman and my husband Tim McGrew did a discussion on the Unbelievable show, and I'm going to be using the version from there. I'll provide a link in the show notes. You do have to sign up for a free Premiere Radio account to get to it, but it doesn't cost anything, and I'll give the minute number when this starts. So that's the version I'm going to be using. The debate was allegedly on undesigned coincidences and whether undesigned coincidences show that the Gospels are reliable reports. It appeared that Ehrman was completely unfamiliar with undesigned coincidences and hadn't even researched them before coming in to the discussion, even though that was the alleged topic of the discussion. So when Tim brought up some UCs from Luke and John concerning Jesus' dialogue with Pilate and the things that Pilate says, Ehrman's response doesn't address the undesigned coincidence at all. And, I'll let you listen, and if you're familiar with undesigned coincidences, you can see why that is. This is something we run across quite a lot with critical scholars. They'll hear about an undesigned coincidence, and they'll just say some stuff about why they think one half of the undesigned coincidences in there, and then they kind of dust their hands like, well, that takes care of that. They haven't really addressed the undesigned coincidence at all. And that's pretty much here, that Ehrman just takes his time spinning out this development theory, which he uses to explain why Pilate says in both Luke and John that he finds no guilt in Jesus, and it's just like a different topic. He's just really changing the subject, and Tim points that out. But it's useful in its own way because it provides us with a nice free online version of a development theory concerning the crucifixion stories that I can point you to and that I can use for this video and the video next time. I decided there was enough material here that I'm going to talk about what Ehrman says about Mark and Matthew and Luke today, and then next time what he has to say about John's crucifixion story and Pilate and alleged anti-Semitism there. What Ehrman does is that he begins with an outright misrepresentation of the content of Mark. Now, it's important to understand at the outset what Ehrman's theory is. Ehrman says that as the sources get later in time, the Christian sources, Pilate becomes increasingly innocent in Jesus' crucifixion, and the Jews become increasingly guilty. He even calls it one of the most striking features. Okay, and in spinning this out, then he's often focusing on Pilate and what Pilate does and what Pilate allegedly doesn't do, because he has this notion that if Pilate becomes less and less to blame, then the anti-Semitism, the hatred of the Jews, is taking up the slack, and the Jews are becoming more and more to blame. So what he indicates is that in the earliest source, which he believes to be Mark, Pilate doesn't need to have his arm twisted. That's his phrase. He says it's in the later sources, Pilate needs to have his arm twisted. And the reason that in the later sources Pilate needs to have his arm twisted, i.e. not in Mark, is because the Christians are blaming the Jews more for Jesus' crucifixion. So that's just inaccurate. Pilate definitely needs his arm twisted in Mark, even if we just focus on this. And if we step back and get a broader focus, you have the whole plot of the Jewish leaders in Mark. You have them trying to find somebody to betray Jesus. You have them planning it. It's all there. You have the trial before the high priest, and then they convict him of blasphemy, and they take him to Pilate. And so to say that in Mark, it's somehow, equal between Pilate and the Jewish leaders and so forth, it's just not true. That backdrop where the Jewish leaders really have this malice, this active malice against Jesus. I don't think that's anti-Semitism, but that's what, Bart is trying to say. If you are going to cast it that way, that's present in Mark even before we get to the scenes with Pilate. But even within the scenes in Pilate, it's a misrepresentation to say that Pilate doesn't need to have his arm twisted. So they bring Jesus, and he asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he says, "Su leges," you've said it. And it says the chief priests began to accuse him harshly. This is Mark 15. And Pilate was questioning him again, saying, "Do you make no answer? See how many charges they bring against you." So who is it accusing him, right? But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was astonished. Now at the feast he used to release for them any one prisoner whom they requested, and then it mentions Barabbas. Verse 9, and Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" Now, verse 10, Mark 15:10, for he was aware that the chief priests had delivered him up because of envy. So, when he suggests that he release Jesus, that is Pilate making some attempt to release Jesus because he believes that they are trying to get rid of him for envy. That's pretty damning comment on these religious leaders. And Pilate, at least to some extent, is trying to release Jesus. Okay. But the chief priests stirred up the multitude to ask him to release Barabbas for them instead. Okay, it's the same story. This is the same story that you get in all the Gospels. The religious leaders, the Jewish religious leaders, are stirring up the crowd. They're pressuring Pilate. All right. And answering again, Pilate was saying to them, "Then what shall I do to him whom you call the King of the Jews?" So again, this is Pilate attempting to have an excuse to release Jesus. And they shouted back, "Crucify him." Now look at this. Verse 14. But Pilate was saying to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." And wishing to satisfy the multitude, Pilate released Barabbas for them. And after having Jesus scourged, he delivered him over to be crucified. Now, Ehrman literally characterizes that as basically, he uses that word basically, Pilate and the Jews are both agreeing that this needs to be done. Okay, that is a complete misrepresentation of that passage. And when he goes to Matthew, he says, but in Matthew, Pilate resists. Implication, he doesn't resist. In Mark, in the later sources, Pilate needs to have his arm twisted. In other words, in this earliest source, he doesn't need to have his arm twisted. Of course he's resisting. It's obvious. Of course he is having his arm twisted, and he is arguing with them to some extent at least. Okay, why don't you let me release Jesus? Or, why? What has he done wrong? So he's disputing with them and trying to release Jesus. That's the same story in all the Gospels, and it's clear as can be right there in Mark. Now, what I think Ehrman is doing, and we find this in some of these development theories, he's taking advantage of the fact that the account in Mark is somewhat shorter than the accounts in the other three Gospels. When you have longer accounts with not only more details, but more sub-incidents, like, we'll get to this in a minute, Pilate sending Jesus to Herod. Okay, that's in Luke. It's not in any of the other Gospels. More dialogue between Jesus and Pilate and so forth. Then you can go in there and you can kind of look around and you can find bits that you think are going to confirm some development hypothesis, and then you're going to say, see, Pilate becomes more and more innocent, or the Jews become more and more guilty, and you just say that, and it has this kind of spurious appearance of reasonableness, because if somebody just casually picks up the Gospels, they can see that Mark's account is shorter, right? So if they accept the scholar's characterization of the material that's additional in the other Gospels, they're like, oh, okay, see, they're longer, they're more developed, and they assume that means that they're more developed in some meaningful sense along the lines of whatever the scholar says. In this case, allegedly Pilate becoming more innocent and the Jews becoming more guilty. But the basic story is right there in Mark. Jesus is hounded down by the malice of the religious leaders. They capture him, they try him, they bring him to Pilate, they insist that he be crucified, they stir up the crowd. Pilate kind of would like to release Jesus because he knows that they're after him for envy, but they're not having any of it, and so he says okay and agrees for Jesus to be crucified. That's it. It's not he and the crowds, he and the leaders are agreeing equally that that this needs to be done. Pilate doesn't think that needs to be done in that passage. So it begins with a mischaracterization of Mark. All right. Then he goes to Matthew. Now, this is one of those cases, like what I said about the Trinitarian baptismal formula, where there's a passage in one gospel, and in both of these cases it happens to be Matthew, that is useful for the development thesis in question, but it's almost too useful because there's nothing in the later gospels like it either. So you have to do what I call a partial development, right? A partial sequence. And Bart pours it on with this. He says, in Matthew, Pilate resists, and he resists so much that he calls for water and he washes his hands and he says he's innocent, and that he's not to be blamed, and the blood of Jesus, the blood of this innocent person, is not on his hands, and the Jewish crowd yells, his blood be upon us and upon our children. Well, that is dramatic. And if you want to make an argument that the Gospels are quote-unquote anti-Semitic, that's probably the passage that you want to go for. I'm going to say more about that in a second, but to complete the thought here, there's nothing like that in Luke or John. Now, Bart, for purposes of this development, at least, claim is going Mark, Matthew, Luke, John. That's what he's claiming is the order, and he's claiming that in Luke and John, the Jews are more to blame. Okay, the Jews are gradually getting more and more to blame as we go on, but it's kind of unfortunate for that thesis that the sort of textbook case, right, is in Matthew, which is on Bart's argument, only the second one in the series, and then there's nothing that strong later on. Now, I am not acknowledging that this is in fact anti-Semitism in Matthew. For one thing, it's the kind of thing that angry people might really do. If you really hate somebody, you just be like, I'll take it, man. We have people on Twitter right now who go out there and they say the most, outrageous things about themselves, and they'll take to themselves whatever nasty title, they're trying to be angry, they're trying to be edgy. And so if this really happened and Matthew is reporting it, then putting a label on it isn't going to make it non-historical. But also, and this is a digression, but there's no excuse for anti-Semitism in biblical apostolic Christianity. All of the apostles were Jews. And Peter himself, right on the day of Pentecost, says to the people, the promises are to you and to your children. So here at the crucifixion, they say, his blood be upon us and on our children. But Peter says the promises are to you and to your children. In other words, forgiveness of sins is being offered. And that's an entirely Jewish crowd. And Paul in Romans also says God has not cast off his people, the Jews. So, yes, this verse was used by later Christians in a heinous and horrible way to excuse persecution of the Jews. But that is contrary to the teaching of biblical Christianity. So I just want to say that right here. But if you want to try to, find a verse, that's probably the one that people think is the worst. And I would be curious. I wonder how many people out there think that verse is in John. Layman, maybe even there's a scholar here or there who hasn't looked it up recently. Because if that verse were in John, man, it would be exhibit A of the pinnacle of this development. But instead, it's in Matthew. Well, so Bart moves on, and what does he have to do? Well, you see, he doesn't have that anymore, because that's not in Luke, and it's not in John. So he's got to find a different way to measure the alleged increasing anti-Semitism in the gospel crucifixion accounts and the alleged increase in Pilate's innocence. Okay? How's he going to do that? And you remember I mentioned this in my methodological discussion last time that, if you're going to pick a measure, you need to stick to that measure. But he can't. He can't stick to the measure of the people calling down the blood of Jesus on their own heads, because it doesn't continue in the other Gospels. I'm not saying the other Gospels are denying it. It's just not found there. So he picks a different measure. His new measure for Luke is the number of times that Pilate says that Jesus is innocent explicitly in so many words. Okay, now he's implying that right there in Mark. Why? What evil has he done? Okay, but Bart decides to start sort of counting, like bean counting. How many times does he explicitly say, I don't find any guilt in him in a given gospel? And he finds 3 of these in Luke. Wow, more times that Pilate is explicitly saying that Jesus is innocent. By the way, I don't believe he uses those exact words anywhere in Matthew, so that again highlights that we're shifting our measure. And so then Bart says that since Pilate says repeatedly that he finds no guilt in Jesus, this is heightening Pilate's innocence. Think about that for just a second. Give that some thought. Isn't that a little strange? It's a terrible measure of Pilate's own innocence. How is Pilate less to be blamed for Jesus' crucifixion if he says more often explicitly that Jesus is innocent of doing any wrong? He's going to give in. I mean, we know how this story ends. He gives in, turns him over to be crucified, sends the soldiers, they crucify him. The more often that he says, I find no guilt in him, I'm bringing him out to you to tell you I find no guilt in him, the more clear it is that Pilate knows he's doing an injustice. He's not living up to his own standards as a Roman. And I think he kind of knew that. I think he had a guilty conscience. I think we see signs of superstition in John, actually. And so he's, if anything, you might say more guilty, the more he emphasizes Jesus' innocence, if you think about it. Okay? Now you could say, well, he's arguing with them. Well, but by that token, he's arguing with them in Mark as well. What Bart has chosen now to hang his hat on is the number of times that he explicitly says that Jesus is innocent in Luke, which is more than the number of times earlier, and that's a terrible measure. For that matter, for Pilate to wash his hands in Matthew doesn't actually make him innocent. Shakespeare understood this. Okay, think of Macbeth. Lady Macbeth, they've got blood on their hands. And she says to Macbeth, a little water clears us of this deed. It's clear that Shakespeare is thinking of Pilate washing his hands. I'm innocent of this man's blood. But a little water does not clear them of this deed. And so then later, what's Lady Macbeth doing? She's walking around. She's saying, out, damned spot. And yet here's a spot. And she's hallucinating blood on her hands. The king's blood, because they murdered him. So Pilate cannot make himself innocent by just going, abracadabra, I wash my hands, I declare myself innocent. And he can't make himself innocent by saying to the people, I find this man to be innocent. So we really just don't find any force to Bart's claims that the Jews become increasingly guilty as we go on, even in the Synoptics, the first three, and I'll talk more about it in John next time. He has to grab things that don't really fit that and try to make it seem that they fit that. He even tries to bring in Herod. Pilate sends Jesus to Herod in Luke. That's unique to Luke, and it talks about Herod's men-at-arms abusing Jesus. And one of the times when Pilate is speaking to the people, he says, and I sent him to Herod, and he didn't find anything wrong either. He didn't find that he'd done anything wrong either. Herod doesn't, we don't have a record of Herod saying that, but Pilate says that. But again, what does this have to do with Pilate being made increasingly innocent? The best you could do if you tried to steel man it would be to say, well, Pilate's arguing more with them. But actually, even when Luke says, he said to them the third time, you can look back to Mark and you can see that those 3 times correspond to the 3 times that Pilate goes out and speaks to them. He may actually speak to them an additional time in Luke that he's not even counting when he says the third time. But it's pretty clear that Bart's getting it from when Luke says he spoke to them the third time. And he goes back repeatedly in all of the Gospels. So, yeah, he's making an effort, quote unquote, but he's not really willing to just keep on risking his neck. And it's very clear, all the Gospels, beginning with Mark, when he sees that there's going to be a riot, he's like, oh, okay, fine. And that's how lightly he is willing to give up his attempt to be a just judge, a just Roman. That in the end, it's like, this isn't worth it. He's very much treating the end as justifying the means. He wants peace in Palestine. If this is what it's going to take to have peace in Palestine, then this is what we'll do. That's clear. That's clear in all of the Gospels, beginning with Mark, even if you think that Mark is the very earliest, which it may have been. But there is no progression. Gospel theories of development are all bunk. Now, it may be 2 weeks, possibly, before the next one goes up, the next presentation here, because next week we're having some new windows installed in my house. One of them is right near where I record my videos. There's just going to be a lot of noise, and so it may not be possible for me to find a good moment to record them. But when I come back, my plan is then to talk about John and the claim of continued progress up into John in anti-Semitism. So I hope you'll come back to the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.